She went to jail because of his schemes while he lived a luxurious life, but she made him pay in court. Dear viewers, welcome to our channel. Subscribe to receive more stories every day. The courtroom buzzed with an uneasy energy as Caroline Whitaker entered, her gaze steady despite the weight of the accusations against her. She was no stranger to this room. It had been her battleground for months, a place where lies disguised as truths had painted her as the mastermind behind a web of financial crimes. The prosecution had called her cunning, manipulative, and cold-hearted. To the outside world, she was the epitome of betrayal, a wife who had turned on her husband, defrauding their joint companies to line her own pockets. But Caroline knew better. She was no criminal. She was a scapegoat. It had started subtly, like a slow-growing crack in the foundation of a once solid marriage. Richard, her husband, had always been ambitious. His charm had swept her off her feet years ago, and together they had built what seemed to be a powerful partnership, both in business and life. Caroline handled the operations while Richard was the face of the empire, a charismatic businessman who thrived on public adoration. They had wealth, influence, and a seemingly perfect life. But beneath the surface, Richard's ambition had grown insatiable, and Caroline began to notice the shadows of his deceit. At first, it was little things: missing files, unexplained meetings, and a growing distance in their relationship. Richard always had excuses, explanations delivered with that same confident smile that had charmed investors and media alike. Caroline wanted to believe him, wanted to hold on to the life they had built. But as the discrepancies in their financial reports became too blatant to ignore, she started asking questions. That was when the mask began to slip. Richard's temper, always hidden behind a polished exterior, flared for the first time. He dismissed her concerns with practiced ease, turning the blame on her. "You're paranoid, Caroline," he had snapped one evening. "Do you think I don't know what I'm doing? This is how business works. Not everything has to be spelled out for you." Her unease grew into suspicion, but before she could piece together the puzzle, the walls came crashing down. One crisp morning, the authorities arrived at their home with search warrants. Richard played the part of the blindsided husband flawlessly, his shock and dismay convincing enough to fool even Caroline for a brief moment. Then they arrested her. The charges were overwhelming: tax fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. Every accusation led back to Caroline. Her name was on the documents, her signature on the forms. Offshore accounts she had never heard of were suddenly tied to her identity. The prosecution painted a damning picture of a greedy wife using her husband's wealth as her personal playground. Richard's testimony only sealed her fate. He had feigned heartbreak, claiming ignorance of her actions while pleading for leniency on her behalf. It was a masterful performance, one that left Caroline convicted in both court and public opinion. Prison was a rude awakening. Stripped of the life she once knew, Caroline was thrown into a world where survival meant adapting quickly. She spent her days replaying every moment, every conversation, searching for the thread that unraveled her life. The betrayal was worse than the sentence. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a life with had orchestrated her downfall with chilling precision. But even in the darkness, Caroline refused to succumb to despair. She wasn't the villain in this story, and she would prove it. Her chance came in the form of a memory, a drunken night over a year before her arrest when Richard had come home late. He had been unusually careless, muttering about cleaning up loose ends and gloating about how untouchable he was. At the time, Caroline had dismissed his ramblings as the result of too much whiskey and arrogance. But her instincts had urged her to act. She had recorded the conversation, her phone capturing Richard's slurred confession of a plan to shift all liability onto her if things ever went wrong. For months, the video had been her secret, something she couldn't bring herself to use, fearing Richard's influence. He had friends in high places, connections that could make evidence disappear or turn it against her. But now, with nothing left to lose, Caroline decided it was time to fight back. From her prison cell, she reached out to a man she never thought she would turn to: James Holloway, Richard's former business rival. James had every reason to hate Richard. Their rivalry was the stuff of business legend, a decades-long battle for dominance that had left both men scarred but undefeated. When Caroline contacted him, she wasn't sure what to expect. Would he see her as an enemy by association or as an opportunity to settle old scores? To her relief, James chose the latter. "If you have what you say you do," he had said during their first tense conversation, "then I'll make sure Richard pays for it." With James's resources and legal team, Caroline began the uphill battle to appeal her conviction. They scrutinized every piece of evidence, every witness statement, searching for inconsistencies. The prosecution's case, which had once seemed airtight, began to show cracks under the weight of their scrutiny. And then there was the video. When James watched the recording for the first time, his usually impassive face lit up with a mixture of satisfaction and fury. "This," he said, "is going to destroy him." Caroline felt a spark of hope for the first time in months. The video was damning. Richard's voice, dripping with arrogance, outlined his scheme in chilling detail. He spoke of offshore accounts, forged signatures, and how he planned to pin everything on Caroline to protect himself. "She won't even see it coming," he had bragged, his words slurring. "Caroline's name is on everything. When the time comes, she'll take the fall, and I'll walk away clean." James wasted no time. The video was submitted as new evidence, and Caroline's legal team demanded a retrial. The media, always hungry for scandal, pounced on the revelation. The narrative shifted overnight. Headlines that had once vilified Caroline now cast her as a wronged woman, a victim of her husband's greed. Public sympathy began to swell, and the courtroom that had once seemed so hostile became a battleground for her redemption. Caroline knew the fight was far from over. Richard was a master manipulator, and she had no doubt he would use every trick in his arsenal to discredit her. But for the first time in months, she felt the tide turning. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was fighting back. And she was determined to win. The media frenzy surrounding Caroline's appeal was nothing short of a circus. Every major news outlet dissected her case, revisiting the moments that had once painted her as a cunning mastermind but now framed her as a victim of her husband's calculated betrayal. The leaked footage of Richard's drunken confession went viral, fueling public outrage. It wasn't just the content of his words that struck a chord. It was the sheer arrogance, the ease with which he had plotted to destroy the life of the woman he once claimed to love. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForCaroline and #RichardTheLiar. Public opinion had shifted dramatically, and with it came the pressure on the judicial system to take a closer look at the case. Caroline, meanwhile, remained cautious. She knew Richard wouldn't go down without a fight. He had always been a man who thrived under pressure, using his charisma to turn any situation to his advantage. Watching the footage of him on morning talk shows only reinforced her fears. With his perfectly tailored suits and carefully measured words, he played the part of the aggrieved husband masterfully. "I trusted her with everything," he told one host, his voice tinged with just the right amount of sorrow. "This has been a nightmare for me too. I just want the truth to come out." But the cracks in his facade were beginning to show. Underneath the polished exterior, Richard was scrambling. His lawyers worked around the clock to suppress the video, claiming it had been obtained illegally. They argued that it was inadmissible in court, a desperate attempt to keep the damning evidence from becoming the cornerstone of Caroline's retrial. Yet, despite their efforts, the video had already done its damage in the court of public opinion. People began to question everything about Richard. His rise to wealth, his business practices, and his carefully cultivated image as a self-made man. Caroline's retrial began under a cloud of anticipation. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and curious onlookers, all eager to witness the unraveling of a case that had captivated the nation. Her legal team, armed with the new evidence, presented a compelling argument. They demonstrated how Richard had meticulously forged documents and manipulated accounts to implicate Caroline. Expert witnesses testified to the extent of the financial fraud, painting a picture of a man whose greed knew no bounds. When the video was finally played in court, the impact was immediate and visceral. Gasps rippled through the gallery as Richard's voice filled the room, his tone dripping with contempt as he laid out his plan. Even the jurors, who had been instructed to remain impartial, couldn't hide their reactions. The prosecution tried to salvage their case, arguing that the video was taken out of context, but it was a weak defense. The damage was done. Caroline, sitting at the defense table, felt a flicker of hope. For months, she had been vilified, her character assassinated by the man who had vowed to stand by her through thick and thin. Now the truth was finally coming to light. But as the trial progressed, she realized that exposing Richard's lies wasn't enough. She wanted justice, not just for herself but for everyone who had been collateral damage in his pursuit of wealth and power. Her chance came during cross-examination. Richard, called to the stand by her legal team, maintained his calm demeanor at first. He denied any wrongdoing, sticking to his narrative that he had been unaware of Caroline's alleged crimes. But under the relentless questioning of James Holloway's lead attorney, his composure began to crack. The attorney, a seasoned litigator with a reputation for uncovering the truth, pressed him on the details of his finances, the timeline of events, and the discrepancies in his statements. "Mr. Whitaker," the attorney said, his voice sharp, "isn't it true that you opened the offshore accounts in question months before Mrs. Whitaker was even made aware of them?" Richard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. "I don't recall the exact timeline," he said, his usual confidence wavering. "Let me help you recall," the attorney replied, holding up a document. "This is a record of the account opening, dated 2 months before the first alleged fraudulent transaction. Your name is the only one listed on this document. Would you care to explain how Mrs. Whitaker could have orchestrated this scheme when she had no access to these accounts?" Richard hesitated, his silence speaking volumes. The attorney seized the moment, hammering him with question after question, each one peeling back another layer of his deceit. By the time the cross-examination ended, Richard's carefully constructed image was in tatters. His arrogance, once his greatest asset, had become his undoing. Outside the courtroom, the tide of public opinion continued to swell in Caroline's favor. Supporters gathered in droves, holding signs and chanting slogans demanding justice. The once lonely battle she had fought from her prison cell had become a movement, a rallying cry for those who had been wronged by the powerful and privileged. But Richard wasn't done yet. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he called a press conference. Standing before a sea of cameras, he spun a tale of victimhood, accusing Caroline of orchestrating a smear campaign to destroy him. It was a bold move, one that might have worked if not for the mountain of evidence against him. The press, no longer under his spell, questioned him relentlessly, poking holes in his story until he was forced to retreat. As the trial neared its conclusion, Caroline felt a mixture of relief and anticipation. She had fought tooth and nail to get to this point, and now the finish line was in sight. But she knew that the ultimate victory wouldn't just come from proving her innocence. It would come from holding Richard accountable for his actions, ensuring that he couldn't hurt anyone else the way he had hurt her. The day of the verdict arrived with a sense of finality. The courtroom was silent as the jury filed in, their expressions unreadable. Caroline held her breath, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. When the foreperson stood and announced the verdict, the words echoed in her ears. "Not guilty." The room erupted in a mix of cheers and gasps. Caroline's eyes filled with tears as the weight of the past year lifted from her shoulders. She had won. She had not only cleared her name but also exposed Richard for the fraud he was. But as she looked across the room at her former husband, she knew the fight wasn't over yet. Justice had been served, but the reckoning was just beginning. Caroline stood outside the courthouse, a free woman for the first time in months. The crowd that had gathered erupted into applause, chanting her name as cameras flashed around her. She held her head high, feeling the crisp autumn air on her face as if breathing deeply for the first time. Beside her, James Holloway clapped her on the shoulder, His usual sharp smirk softened into something almost like admiration. "You did it," he said. "Well, technically we did it. But I'd say you earned this moment." Caroline nodded, her voice steady but resolute. "We're not finished yet." He tilted his head, curious. "I take it you've got something up your sleeve." Her gaze hardened, her thoughts sharpening into focus. For months, she had been the target of Richard's schemes, reduced to a pawn in his selfish game. But now, with her name cleared and the public firmly on her side, Caroline intended to take back more than just her freedom. She wanted to dismantle everything Richard had built on the ruins of her life. The courtroom victory was just the beginning. The retrial had uncovered layers of Richard's crimes that extended far beyond the frame job he had pinned on Caroline. Fraud, tax evasion, and illegal business dealings were just the tip of the iceberg. His empire, once so carefully curated, was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. The companies that had partnered with him were now racing to distance themselves, and investors were pulling out in droves. Still, Richard remained defiant, clinging to the scraps of his reputation. Caroline intended to ensure there was nothing left for him to cling to. Within days of the verdict, Caroline filed a civil suit against Richard for damages, citing the emotional, financial, and reputational harm he had caused. The lawsuit was a strategic move, one that would force him to face her again in court under far less favorable circumstances. This time she wasn't the one on trial, he was. Richard's arrogance had always been his greatest weakness. Even as his legal team scrambled to mitigate the fallout, he couldn't resist firing back. He went on a media blitz, accusing Caroline of weaponizing public sympathy against him. "She's no innocent victim," he sneered during one televised interview. "This is just another chapter in her vendetta to destroy me." But the more he spoke, the deeper the hole he dug for himself. Caroline's legal team wasted no time compiling his statements as evidence of defamation and retaliation. The public, already weary of his antics, turned on him with renewed fury. Social media exploded with calls for accountability, with many demanding he be charged for the full extent of his crimes. Caroline, meanwhile, remained composed. She refused interviews, letting her silence speak volumes. Every appearance in court was a masterclass in poise and determination. Her lawyers presented a damning case, meticulously outlining the damages she had suffered. Expert witnesses testified to the financial losses she had incurred, the business opportunities she had missed, and the irreparable harm to her reputation. But it was Caroline's own testimony that delivered the final blow. "I trusted Richard with everything," she told the court, her voice unwavering. "Not just my finances but my life, my future, and my sense of self. He didn't just betray me. He robbed me of years I'll never get back. And yet I stand here today not as a victim but as a survivor. Because no matter how much he tried to destroy me, I refused to let him win." The courtroom was silent as her words sank in. Even the judge seemed moved, her expression softening as she glanced at Caroline. In contrast, Richard sat rigid in his chair, his face pale and his hands clenched into fists. For the first time, he looked like a man who knew he had lost. The verdict in the civil suit came swiftly. The jury awarded Caroline a substantial settlement, one that would leave Richard financially crippled. But the true victory came moments later, when the district attorney's office announced new charges against Richard based on evidence uncovered during the retrial. The charges included tax evasion, fraud, and obstruction of justice, each carrying the potential for significant prison time. Caroline watched as Richard was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, his once polished image reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale. The crowd outside erupted into cheers as news of his arrest spread like wildfire. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, their lenses trained on Caroline as she emerged victorious. But her fight wasn't just about punishing Richard. It was about reclaiming her life and using her story to inspire others. In the weeks following the trial, she launched a foundation dedicated to supporting victims of financial abuse and wrongful convictions. The foundation, aptly named Reclaim Justice, quickly gained traction, attracting donations from around the world. Caroline's story became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, it was possible to rise above and fight back. Interviews and speaking engagements poured in, but she remained grounded, focusing on the work that mattered most. For her, the greatest victory wasn't in the courtroom or the headlines. It was in the knowledge that she had turned her pain into purpose. One evening, as she sat in her modest but cozy new home, Caroline reflected on how far she had come. The woman she had been a year ago felt like a distant memory, naive, trusting, and unprepared for the storm that would change her life. But that storm had forged her into someone stronger, someone who could weather any challenge. Her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from James Holloway, congratulating her on the foundation's success. Attached was a link to an article titled, "The Fall of Richard Whittaker: How Greed and Arrogance Destroyed a Titan." Caroline smiled as she skimmed the piece, noting the sharp contrast between Richard's downfall and her rise. In the end, justice hadn't just been served, it had been reclaimed. And for Caroline, that was worth everything. Dear viewers, thank you for watching. If you like this story, please subscribe to our channel to receive more stories every day. Share with us what you think of this story.